Hey everyone, this is Jamie McAllister. Welcome to today's session, which is SharePoint Real World Upgrade. And thank you for Visual SP for giving me the opportunity for speaking today. Perhaps you'd like to meet me first. So this is Jamie McAllister. I am a SharePoint architect living and working in Switzerland. I've been an MVP since 2013. I do a little bit of public speaking around SharePoint and Cloud now and again. For my sins, I'm a Prince 2 practitioner and Scrum Master, which helps when you have to manage the occasional project. You can find my blog at jamiemcallister.com or my YouTube channel, Jamie McAllister MVP. So what are we going to talk about today? Okay, so this is all about upgrading SharePoint, but let's talk about the state of SharePoint now. What version of SharePoint do people have in their organizations? Where would they like to go in future? Are there any things which are forcing people to upgrade right now? Are there features which your organization is dying to have in new versions? And if you take the decision to upgrade, we're going to be looking at how you design your farm, how you move any custom solutions over, how you migrate your content, because that's rather important, and then my own little official release notes, because I've done this sort of project for real, and I would like you to learn from my experience. This is also rather unofficial, but these are some rough figures from last year detailing what version of SharePoint various organizations had at the time of the survey. If you listen to a different polling organization, you will get different figures. This is just the way it is. But to cut a long story short, there are very few organizations on the very old versions of SharePoint now, like SharePoint 2007. It was good in its day, but there are better versions around now. You've got a significant number of people using SharePoint Online. If you talk to Microsoft, they'll say it's much more than 20%. More than half of respondents are using SharePoint 2010 or 2013, so they're still the workhorse for many organizations with on-premises SharePoint, and a fair few organizations are using SharePoint 2016 already. From my experience talking to people, there's already been a big surge of people upgrading to 2016 in the US, for example. In Europe, those projects are coming along, but it's more happening this year than last year. So, why upgrade? Well, this is something which weighed on my organization's mind. When you install a particular version of SharePoint, it is not supported forever. These are the dates that these various versions of SharePoint finished mainstream support and extended support. So you can see that both SharePoint 2010 and SharePoint 2013 have fallen out of mainstream support already. What does that mean? It's not the end of the world. When they were in mainstream support, there was investment not just in making sure that they were safe and secure and maintained in that way, but some new features were being produced and made available through service packs, cumulative updates, this sort of thing. Once mainstream support ends, you no longer get those updates, but you do get critical updates for security and that sort of thing. However, once the extended support date passes, you no longer even get those. So that is a red flag. If you're coming up to an extended support deadline for your organization's version of SharePoint, you really want to think about upgrading and getting onto a supported version. As you can see, for SharePoint 2010, we're coming up to that day in 2020. So it's definitely time to be thinking, if you're using that version, are we going to want to upgrade soon? It just lets your CIO sleep better at night, which I've always thought was important. Beyond those versions, we now know, of course, this was first announced at Ignite last year, and we've had a lot more details at SharePoint Conference this year. SharePoint Server 2019 is coming to us this year. So we'll be getting the preview, well, very soon, and we'll be getting a release in late 2018. So this is another thing coming down the tracks and something we're going to talk about a little later. Okay. If you are thinking about upgrading to any version of SharePoint, one of the things you have to consider is what it is going to give your organization. There are going to be business needs and there are going to be IT benefits. Here is a list which by no means would be the same for every organization, but these are some of the things which I found very interesting when I was looking to upgrade from SharePoint 2010 to SharePoint 2016. For the business, many people in the business had been hassling me for a long time, wanting to co-edit Excel spreadsheets in real time. It turns out if you have SharePoint 2016 and Office Online servers as part of your farm, you can do that in the browser, even when the users are thousands of miles apart. Very nice. Also, although you have on-premises SharePoint, you may want to start connecting that to SharePoint Online, doing the various clever things that allows you to do. So hybrid farm is an interesting possibility. Mobility of data and devices is basically a must-have for most organizations now. OneDrive and the ability to save files and share them easily is available for SharePoint 2016, and this can be 100% on-premises if you wish. And if you have rules which say that all your data has to be on-premises, this is of course very interesting. We tend to get a better search experience with every version of SharePoint. Drag and drop uploading files, this is something the business wanted for a long time. Forms and workflow has been very stale for some time. It's actually several years since they told us not to use Infopath anymore to create forms, but they hadn't announced any sort of replacement when we began doing this project. Also, editing content such as pages drives a lot of my users crazy. We were hoping, fingers crossed, for some benefits there, and there are various compliance features which sounded kind of interesting too. But of course, IT needs some benefits as well. Sometimes those benefits are helping to reduce the workload in IT, and sometimes they're helping, once again, to give the business what it needs. For one thing, mainstream support. Let our CIOs sleep soundly in their beds. Another interesting thing was feature packs. This was touted as an ability for Microsoft to release these feature packs, and valid new features could be installed into SharePoint even when you'd already built your farm and installed everything. And in fact, the next one, SharePoint Framework, a new way of developing in SharePoint, was released as a feature pack in September 2017. A lot of modern development is also based on calling into the remote interfaces of SharePoint, Client Object Model and REST. SharePoint 2016 compared to SharePoint 2010 had many more capabilities that you could call into through these remote interfaces. We'll talk about solutions later on and why I think that's important. Another huge one, Binroll and patching. It was promised that if you built your SharePoint 2016 farm as a Binroll, something which we'll talk about later again, and this is a standard way of building your farm with defined roles for different servers. If you built it in a particular way, high availability design, you could actually patch your farm without any downtime whatsoever, which is very attractive, especially if you're in a global organization where there's really no time in the 24-hour clock where someone isn't using your SharePoint. It was also promised that over wide area networks, this version would be less chatty, so better network performance, raised thresholds. The terrible list view default limit of 5,000 annoys a lot of people, better browser support, especially for Chrome and that sort of thing. And finally, Bill Bayer had said at an event that I was at that this version of SharePoint was a foundational release. And I like the sound of that, because if I'm going to upgrade to a new version of a product, I want it to be on the track of future developments too. I don't want it to be completely different. So I like the sound of that. I believed him, and this was a motivator for me. But we have details about SharePoint 2019 as well. If I was doing this project again, my list changes ever so slightly. Many of the business needs are exactly the same. With OneDrive, they're touting a better synchronization client. I like the sound of that. Forms and workflow, there are some good improvements there because we have a new workflow engine, which is going to be available in that version. Plus, we have these wonderful things called Power Apps and Flow, which are available in the cloud, which gives us form and workflow capabilities, but we can connect to those things through, well, a connector. Improved content editing is definitely in the pipe for this one, and there was a real surprise at SharePoint Conference this year because virtual reality spaces, SharePoint spaces, were announced. So you'll be able to host virtual reality content in SharePoint. Now, it's going to be very interesting to see where this goes. IT benefits, comparing 2010 to 2019, very much the same, except feature packs. They've now decided they were a bad idea and they've gone away. Okay. But everything else pretty much the same. The only additional thing which is being mentioned for 2019 is there's going to be some sort of Microsoft migration tool allowing organizations to migrate to this version without paying for a commercial tool. More about that later. Okay, so if you're going to do any sort of project like this, the first thing you have to do is, well, the organization has got to say, yes, let's spend some money and do this. So ultimately, you're going to have to build a business case, and the business case is going to be the foundation for the funding for the project. Obviously, you're going to have to do a cost-benefit analysis, but there'll be some intangibles in there as well. You can't necessarily say for sure how much co-editing Excel is going to benefit the business in monetary terms. It can be difficult to say that, but these things go in the business case anyway, even the intangibles. It's not always monetary value. What's the monetary value of staying in support? I don't know. It would be a real guesstimate, wouldn't it? Before you do anything, even getting the project started, I strongly suggest that you build a sandbox environment, a single server version of SharePoint that you are going to use, and then evaluate it. See if the look and feel is very different. Put some test content in there. Try and port some of your solutions into it and see, because sometimes they just work, porting over without any changes. See if anything seems horribly broken when you do that. And, show it around to the business. See what they think. See if you're selling them on the new features which you're making available here. And this is all going to go into the business case too. Plus, for example, if your solutions seem horribly broken, it's going to help you do your estimation for your project plan. Now, it's very much in vogue to suggest that every project should be agile or Scrum or whatever these days. I have plenty of experience with those sort of projects, so I can tell you, for an upgrade project like this, waterfall is absolutely fine, because at the end of the day, you have to do this in a set order. You have to build out the infrastructure, i.e. the servers or the virtual servers. You have to turn the relevant servers into SharePoint servers. Then you have to port your solutions over. You have to port your data over. You have to do thorough testing, including UAT. You have to train your users thoroughly on all the great new features and emphasize what hasn't changed, and do lots and lots of documentation, do tutorials, do videos, the whole thing. This all has to go into your project plan, and this is not a small undertaking. In fact, I think it's fair to say my project was the work of about 10 different people, because you have to employ specialists for many of the things that you're doing here, especially for an enterprise. Okay, so let's talk about that first step, the whole farm design thing. This is a typical topology for an old SharePoint 2010 farm, medium-sized organization. You might have a couple of web front-end servers which are handling, the requests for the pages and that sort of thing. You'll have 2 application servers, one which has the job of doing search indexing, and then you might have a couple of SQL servers for redundancy. Okay, pretty normal, but things have changed in 2016 and 2019. We have this new thing called Binroll, which is this cloud-born architecture. The story behind this is that now, because of SharePoint Online, Microsoft are hosting, hundreds of thousands of servers, which are the basis of their cloud platform. They've learned a lot of lessons in terms of scalability and stability. because of course you want these things in the cloud environment to be very stable. Otherwise your customers start asking for their money back. So they came up with this thing called Binroll. It takes the guesswork out of farm design because you have standard roles for the servers in your SharePoint farms. It's also much more stable than some of the older designs because at the end of the day, before this was standardized, you used to have consultants building SharePoint servers in all sorts of different ways. They weren't necessarily standard across different organizations. Not so good. There are also some suggested topologies available on the Microsoft website which helps you figure out just what you should be building for your organization, dependent on size and other requirements. So for example, if you want a small non-high availability Binroll farm, post feature pack 1, this is for 2016 because they haven't posted this information for 2019 yet, you can do this. So you can combine these Binrolls. You can have 2 per server in a specific configuration. So here we've got a front end with also the distributed cache role, an application server with search. We have an Office Online server, which is going to give us some of that Excel co-editing, and then we've got a SQL server at the back end. Now I have to say, this is not high availability design, so if you patch this, you are going to lose the service for the period that you're patching, just to say. But you know, managing 4 servers is a pretty nice amount. This is going to suit a lot of small organizations if they have to have on-premises SharePoint. Going forward then, here is a rather different setup, and this is the sort of thing which I might go for a medium scale deployment. So we have 2 web front ends, we have 2 application servers, but I've combined them with search. We have 2 Office Online servers giving us the Excel co-editing, the ability to edit PowerPoints in our browser, etc. All very good stuff. We have 2 distributed cache, and then we have 2 SQL servers. Perhaps we're using clustering, or perhaps there was a SQL always on. What this has given me now is a topology which I can patch each of the individual servers, and if I do it in the right order, I'm not going to have any downtime when I do that patching. Plus, if we have any problems with any given server, you know, if one of the distributed cache decides to fall over, the whole farm will keep running. So we've got a very nice stable topology here. The only problem with this, if you compare it to my medium scale design for SharePoint 2010, that was 6 servers, and this is 10. But if your organization prizes stability, 0 downtime, etc., then you may want to invest in this. It's up to your organization and you to discuss it. Okay, so once you've built your farm, it's time to think about getting your solutions migrated over. Let's fill in a little bit of context here then. Back in the day, 2003, 2006, we were able to code solutions which we deployed to our SharePoint environment. These were binary solutions. They were very powerful. It allowed us to do lots of good things for the business. But it did turn out that if you coded these things badly, and they could have memory leaks and all this sort of thing, you could actually bring your servers down. Around this time, Microsoft were getting interested in hosting SharePoint Online. And they realized that if they allowed full trust solutions like this, it could be that your custom solutions for your organization's SharePoint Online could bring down the service on a server, affecting other organizations sharing the services of that server in the cloud. So they started bringing in more limited models to try and get around this. In SharePoint 2010 we had this thing called sandbox solutions, and they started providing richer abilities to call SharePoint through the remote interfaces such as the client object model. But sandbox didn't really hit the spot for most SharePoint developers, and coded sandbox solutions were deprecated for SharePoint 2013, and we had this new thing called the app model, which was yet another way of developing for SharePoint. And now, in SharePoint 2016 and 19, we have this thing called SharePoint Framework, which is the new modern way to develop SharePoint solutions, which doesn't risk bringing down the SharePoint servers. It's good for SharePoint Online, and it's good for SharePoint on-premises. You can use it for both. The other thing is, Microsoft are using it to develop their own solutions within SharePoint. which means it's got investment, it's got backing. These people are interested in this. It wasn't always true of the app model. Don't tell them I said that. So I think SharePoint Framework has got legs. It's going to be interesting to keep watching this space. Anyway, looking at this timeline as an architect shapes my thinking when I'm advising what sort of solutions we should be developing. For example, using SharePoint 2010, I didn't have the app model available to me, but I didn't want to write lots of full trust solutions because I knew we would want to upgrade one day, and who knows what sort of trouble they might give us. Where there was the possibility of not having full trust solutions, I would take it. So here is one pattern which I've used, which is, for example, instead of using and creating custom timer jobs, I might create solutions on other boxes. Perhaps servers within my organization might even use Azure, and I would schedule these recurrent tasks, and they would just call into SharePoint using the client object model. This meant that I didn't have any nasty binary solutions running on my SharePoint servers and putting them in danger. Once again, stability is something that I care about a lot with my SharePoint. But of course, there were some full trust solutions as well. I had to install these to the new version of SharePoint and basically thoroughly test them, see what was happening. Also, and you can never really get away from this, this is a document set welcome page, by the way. Just one way of getting results was to put some jQuery on here, which mined some of the information that was there, such as the SKU, and then did some searching and some other interesting stuff. Because of the way that the HTML is on document set welcome page, you can see the pretty horrible .parent, .next, .next, .text, .split stuff. I must admit, for these sort of script-based solutions, I was pretty worried that they wouldn't port very well. And I had to test that too. What actually happened? Well, you won't believe it. The compiled code solutions, these full trust solutions, we were able to deploy these to SharePoint 2016 without any changes at all, and they worked fine. Although, yeah, the more you test them, you might find minor things, but I was amazed that they worked ostensibly pretty much first time. Although I do recommend that you do recompile these things and put in references to the new SharePoint binaries, but just saying, it's easier than you think. The CSOM calls, those remote jobs on the Azure or other servers, also were able to work without recoding, and they were able to use the old client component. Now, once again, I'm not suggesting that you do that, but the initial testing showed us that it worked without changes. But do recode them and do use the latest, more powerful features within the API if you can, and if you can invest. The JavaScript needed only minor changes too, so this is all pretty surprising stuff. Very pleasant experience porting solutions from the old to the new. There was slightly different HTML on the document set welcome page, for example. There was this thing called minimum download strategy, so sometimes we had to explicitly call for the download of a SharePoint script library that we wanted to use where we hadn't before, and we had to change our references in our jQuery. But long story short, that's actually not a lot of work, and so even our script solutions tended to work. The only thing that we had to do a total re-implementation for was our custom search pages. We had changed our search results pages in SharePoint 2010 so that instead of having the search results going down the page as paragraphs, they actually looked like a list view with defined columns, and you could sort them and this sort of thing. The business really loved that stuff. But in SharePoint 2016, that all worked in a completely different way. We'd done it using XSL in 2010, but we had to use the new model in 2016. So it was a total re-implementation, and that was some work. Watch out for that sort of thing. But in any case, all this stuff has to be thoroughly tested because you can find minor differences which you weren't expecting. Okay, content migration. Okay, so here's the story. I was doing a bit of research about what migration tools there are to move your content from old versions of SharePoint to new ones, or even to SharePoint Online. And let's just say there's a very large list indeed. I could have put this really long list just onto a couple, well, it probably would have been about 5 PowerPoint slides. I didn't really want to do that. I've been searching for a way to present the data slightly more engaging, so I hope this isn't too painful. Anyway, to cut a long story short, there are a veritable galaxy of SharePoint migration tools out there. Some of these are specialized for particular versions of SharePoint. Some of these only work for on-premises. Some of these are specifically designed to move content to SharePoint Online. There are many different things that they do, many different license costs, and I think even some of the vendors who've produced these aren't so interested in these tools anymore. Seems like there was a real gold rush to get these out there, and they're just not every one of these tools has been adopted, put it that way. But there are certain industry leaders which tend to get the most press, and they're very good tools. For my purposes, I directly used MetaLogics Content Matrix and Sharegate, the SharePoint migration tool, so I can speak with authority about these two and what they do. Because here's the thing, if you're doing an on-premises migration and you read the marketing materials for these migration tools, I have to say it looks fantastic. Check it out. You're going to have SharePoint 2010 database there. Well, you know, SharePoint 2010 data, let's call it. Let's not confuse things. And you use these tools. It's going to port the data, you know, the documents, the list content, the permissions, the site structure, everything over to your new SharePoint 2016. It sounds absolutely wonderful, doesn't it? So no intermediate steps. It's just going to do it all for you. Just click the button. Sounds fantastic. The other way which you can use to move your data from your old SharePoint to your new SharePoint is something called the DB attach. This is not something that you can do in the cloud. This is purely an on-premises thing. But what you do is you get your SharePoint content databases in SQL Server, you get them up to the relevant version, you take a backup of them, and then you attach those copies of the database to SharePoint 2016, and you say, here is your new site collection database, and SharePoint 2016 says, thanks very much. And that has moved everything in the content database over, which includes the content, the permissions, the site structure, the content types, the metadata, etc. The only things that it hasn't moved is the stuff that resides in other databases, such as you know, the search index and things like that. But this is stuff that you rebuild anyway. Don't worry about it. It gets a little bit more complicated if you're in an older version of SharePoint, unfortunately. If you're in SharePoint 2010, for example, then you have to upgrade the database to SharePoint 2013 somehow, and then to SharePoint 2016. There's no path over, and to be absolutely clear about this, there's no way to just kind of put in a USB key and upgrade your SharePoint version to SharePoint 2016 in place on the same servers. You have to build a new farm for this, and that's true for 2019 as well. If you were upgrading to 2019, you're also going to have the DB attach method. So here we are, 2016 to 2019. Can you guess what's coming? Yes, I'm afraid so. It's been announced recently that there is no leapfrogging going to be available here. So if you're upgrading from 2010 to 2019, you're going to have to go through 2 intermediate stages of upgrading your databases before you attach it to 2019. Ouch. What worked best in the real world? Well, I have to say, DB attach was fantastic. It brought over the content, permissions, everything else faithfully, and it was also very quick. Yes, indeed, we did build a small staging environment of SharePoint 2013 that we could just attach the databases and upgrade them, but it wasn't so bad. We used a tool called Feature Admin, which is a free tool you can find online, that allowed us to get rid of any kind of feature dependencies which was giving us problems as we moved the databases from one environment to the other. But basically, yeah, really good. The only thing that DB attach doesn't do for you is there's this new technology called shredded storage, which is actually something in SQL, which gives you a lot of benefits in terms of saving you space when you saving multiple versions of content. Well, that's one of the benefits. Anyway, if you move your databases over straight like this, it's not considered to be shredded storage. However, if you have to do any movement of your content to reorganize, which is something that's very welcome when you're doing these sort of upgrades, it's a good opportunity to reorganize your content as well. Then as soon as the content has been moved and rewritten, it benefits from shredded storage. Fine. Using the migration tools, which was also something I did for some of my site collections, was a little bit disappointing, especially if you'd read the marketing material, because in certain cases lookup columns did not get migrated properly. Permissions were lost. Metadata was lost under certain circumstances. For example, we had some content types in a library. The library had actually been built from a template. Moving that over with the migration tool, all the columns in the content type which had been built from the template were just completely invisible to the tool, and it was a silent error. I didn't like that. The other thing is, if you're using the migration tools, every single SharePoint item which you migrate is effectively a write of a new document into the new SharePoint environment. So it bloats your SQL log files really terribly. So you have to keep on top of that during the migration. The throughput also varied for the tools. But at the end of the day, if you're taking the opportunity to reorganize your site structure as part of the migration, which I very strongly recommend, for example, some legacy SharePoint environments have got very deep structures where you have subsite after subsite after subsite, and they can be difficult to navigate and understand. It's kind of better to break those out into having many more top-level site collections, perhaps with their own site collection DB, and just try and make things flatter. You can actually do those reorganizations if you have these migration tools, because you're able to drag and drop the content and structure to these new places. So they can be pretty good for that. But for the wholesale migration of a farm of any size, I would suggest using both of these methods from my experience. One other thing which was fine for DB attach but was a problem using the migration tools was so-called invisible files. If you have libraries where the users have added files but they have never checked in a version, they can see that content in the libraries, and that's absolutely fine. But even if you've got site collection admin, generally speaking, you don't see that content in the library, and the tools, the migration tools, have only got the same permissions that you've got. They don't see that content either. If it's a DB attach, it's all within the database, so it's fine. But if it's not, your migration tools are not going to see this content, and you have the potential of losing this content, forgetting to migrate it, because you simply don't see it. The way around this is to write, for example here, some PowerShell, which is going through each of your SharePoint lists and libraries, and it's looking at this property checked out files. This is files that don't have a checked in version. And then you can send yourself a report of these, and then you can go in, take ownership of them, and check these in before the migration, or you can get your users to check them in. But it's essential you do this, otherwise you may be losing content during your migration. In terms of the actual tools then, I don't want to put too much emphasis on this because this was my own personal experience in my own environment, and it could be completely different for you. But MetaLogics, very powerful tool with many options, including the ability to migrate deletions, very nice. If you right-clicked on any given content, there were many extra options that you could do from the tool, such as check-in items, etc. You could auto-generate PowerShell for any actions which you undertook in the migration, which meant you could kind of tweak it and get these things to run again in exactly the same way, which was nice. And there was a way to compare sites in the old and the new farm, which was interesting when you were doing delta migrations. More about that later. Weaknesses were we had to install a component on our actual SharePoint servers for best effect. I try not to install extra stuff on SharePoint if at all possible. Stability once again. Found the throughput quite slow with MetaLogics. We were only getting about 1 GB per hour migrated. We spoke with their support and went through things. We couldn't get it any faster, unfortunately. MetaLogics license costs for Content Matrix were based on the size of the farm, i.e. how much content you've got in there, which is kind of like penalizing you for your own success, and had a particular issue with 2016 because we found more storage actually being used in 2016 for the exact same content being moved over from 2010. Once again, more about that later. Also, this was the tool where migrating template-based content lost the metadata. Not fun. Sharegate had much faster throughput, between 3 and 5 times, I believe. We didn't have to install any components on the servers for it to work fine, and it was licensed per seat, so it just depended how many people were using the migration tool, and that's what the cost was based on. If your farm was 5 terabytes in size, you didn't pay extra for that. It had some weaknesses though. It didn't always preserve the author metadata as well as MetaLogics had done. It wasn't fully featured, but it was well featured, put it that way. MetaLogics is definitely the richer tool in terms of the options that it has. You weren't able to auto-generate PowerShell, but you could write PowerShell yourself to do migration tasks. And for some reason, certain types of SharePoint list, not library, but list, it couldn't work out that it had already migrated it, and it would migrate it again and create second versions, which you had to go in and laboriously clean. But overall, Sharegate was a real boon to the project, and I really liked using it. Okay, so let's talk about some real-world issues that happened when we were doing all this stuff. Building the servers, because of this new Binroll, this standard way to do it, was actually very, very fast. So we were able to do that part of the project ahead of schedule. Also, moving many, many hundreds of gigabytes over as DB attach was also very fast. Even though we were going through this SharePoint 2013 staging farm, saved us a lot of time and actually got us ahead of schedule. Also, solution migration only needed a few changes in general to get this working, so that was also better than expected. Ahead of schedule, what did we do? Well, we put this back to the business, and the business asked us to divert those savings into further disaster recovery testing and documenting that testing. I would like to think that we've got a double bonus there. Not only did we get things done a bit faster than we expected, but we have a rock solid disaster recovery plan, which is something that you shouldn't forget anyway. So how did it go? Well, here's another thing. When you put a product in front of users which looks even just a little bit different to the old one, and of course 2016 looks different to 2010, you start to get reports of several fake errors. People say that things aren't working because they're just unfamiliar with clicking in that environment. You have to be careful of that sort of thing, but expect it, be prepared for it, and give the best to the users. Make sure that they get the support that they need and are shown that things aren't broken. This is important. Also, although I say that our solutions that we ported over generally didn't need any changes, the teams that had the fewest issues, because there were certain configurations that they had to do in their own apps, for example, the teams that did testing had the fewest issues when we went live. The people who were very casual about it, the teams who said, yeah, it's great, it's all working, mysteriously enough, they had more issues because they just hadn't tested. This is just the way it goes. Okay, some other strange things then. Moving, let's say, 100 gigabytes of content from 2010 to 2016 resulted in that content being perhaps 90% more. So it would be 190 gig rather than 100 when we moved it to 2016. Some of this was undoubtedly because we were reorganizing the content and putting it into new site collections, but it couldn't be entirely explained that way. Going to various experts to ask them about this, it was kind of unclear from their side as well, so that was kind of strange. We wanted to use the SharePoint mobile app for on-premises. We had to have public certificates available to do that. So that dictated what URL we could use for the mobile app access. So this is something to watch out for. It's not particularly spelled out in the documentation until you reach that point. The other thing is, when you are doing a major migration between SharePoint farms like this, if your farm is of any size, you just can't move everything over in one big bang. You can't wave goodbye to the users on the Friday evening and have everything ready for them by the Monday morning. So what you tend to do is move your content over, such as your DB attaches, etc., spend a lot of work configuring the new farm, but then you have to start doing delta migrations to bring some of that content over that's changed since you did the DB attaches, etc. This is something that you definitely need those migration tools for. But it can also be tricky to find what's changed, etc., etc. Watch out for this one. We had some issues using SQL Always On to get the SQL failover settings exactly right. The reason I mentioned this is when you're doing SQL Server build for any major enterprise or any significant enterprise, just make sure that you're employing experts that know what they're doing, because the SQL Server is the absolute bedrock of SharePoint, and you have to make sure you get it right. Don't try to do this yourselves if you don't know what you're doing. Okay, we already mentioned that we had to rebuild the search experience because of the new model. If you have suddenly a 12 server farm instead of a 6 server farm, then patching and support needs a bit of work. Perhaps you're going to do some work to put scripts in place to help do the patching, etc. This needs investment. One feature that we wanted to use in SharePoint 2016 was geotags. So this was very strange. Although we were using SQL 2016 in the back end, we had to install the SQL 2012 components to get geotags working in SharePoint 2016. It shouldn't be that way. I guess someone hasn't recoded something since SharePoint 2013. Just saying. And the other thing is, if you're deploying an app store so that you can fully use the app model in your new SharePoint, you have to have a domain specifically for your app store, not a subdomain. This can also cause issues in some organizations, depending how controlled that sort of thing is. How did it go? Well, I think we got a lot of what we were asking for the SharePoint 2016 upgrade. Co-editing Excel worked like a dream. We had the ability to do a hybrid farm. Mobility certainly worked better. OneDrive was appreciated. Search was good. Drag and drop was good. But in 2016, there was no new investment in forms and workflow. The page editing experience wasn't improved. And the compliance features were only available in the cloud. We couldn't use them. Shame. The network performance seemed better, but I put a question mark because we didn't benchmark it properly, to be honest. So I can't hold my hand up and say, yes, it definitely worked better over WAN. We still got some complaints from the offices thousands of miles away that things seemed slow. What can you do? And the raised thresholds, which were mentioned before the release of 2016, the list view threshold wasn't going to be 5,000 anymore, etc., never materialized. If we were doing the same project for 2019, I have to say that you get much better results. For example, some of the things we missed out on in 2016, forms and workflow. Not only do you have the new workflow engine in 2019 coming up for those SharePoint Designer workflows, but you now have better integration with Power Apps and Flow, which, especially Flow, are two fantastic emerging tools which can give great business benefit. If you're not familiar with them, I strongly recommend you check those out. Content editing of pages is going to improve. We've got these communications sites, etc., which are going to be in the new product, and we're going to get these things, virtual reality spaces. It's going to be kind of interesting to see what happens there. Raised thresholds, there's no information on that yet. Perhaps the list view threshold will still be 5,000. When we get the new product, we shall see later this year, and we'll have to see if the migration tool, which will be available, is going to give us results which say we could forsake our Sharegates, our MetaLogics, or one of those many other tools which I mentioned before. Okay, in terms of user adoption, like I said before, I would deem it unwise to try and do some sort of big bang release where you try and move everything over and configure everything so that all the users on the Monday morning just start using the new SharePoint. It's unrealistic. You're going to have a period of parallel running where you're using the old and the new, and what I suggest is perhaps business area or by site collection, you have a date where you move them over. Say you move all the accounting people over to the new SharePoint on a given day, and you can set your old site collection that they used to be read-only, for example, and then eventually you can cut off access to it. So you're going to do a series of delta migrations and a gradual release of your content to different business areas. It's too much of a business risk to just try and move everybody at the same time, because if you interrupted operations in some way, you're going to be in big trouble. In terms of moving to the new SharePoint, there was little new for users to learn, although it did look different and some of the buttons were in different places, and there were some nice new features to show them. Generally, it was still SharePoint, so, no one freaked out when we put it in front of them, which was nice. You have to have some different phases here. You have to orient them with the new product before you get them to adopt it so that they know what's coming. Make sure you're doing the training sessions. And just one other thing to mention, I had a lot of users that loved to use the datasheet in 2010. The experience completely changed in 2016, and I have to say it was very unpopular. And unfortunately, because it's a completely different way of it working in the background, there was nothing I could do about it. Okay, so where do you go once you've done an upgrade like this? Well, for me, looking at the way SharePoint development is going, etc., I would eventually refactor all my binary solutions out of the farm. There are now alternative ways of doing them that doesn't involve that compiled code running on your servers. SharePoint Framework is getting more and more powerful, and it's going to be interesting to utilize that where that seems appropriate. The whole mobility angle I will be pushing there, and I like the social features. I like the virtual reality features if they turn out to have business benefit. This is all good stuff. So in conclusion, 2016 compared to the older versions of SharePoint definitely provides valuable new features. Building the farm under Binroll is very straightforward. DB attach seems like a very nice way to migrate your data. The guidance in the documentation wasn't always very clear to us, so we missed out some configuration dependencies which we had to chase afterwards. Perhaps slight delays in those activities, but so look out for those. It's just lessons learned. And solution migration, Microsoft have done a great job at backwards compatibility. It was suspiciously simple to get our old solutions working in the new one. And I have to say, if we had been doing this migration to 2019 instead of to 2016, I think everything on my wish list would have been fulfilled. I'll say it again, a big bang release is not the way to go. You can't move everyone over in one go. Just be aware that delta migrations are challenging. You have to be finding the content which has changed and moving that over regularly, ready for your users to finally adopt the new platform and turn off the old platform. And that includes finding content which they have deleted or not checked in, which is not always straightforward. I'll also say SharePoint 2016 uses a lot of server resources compared to 2010. For example, if you have like internal hosting to build virtual machines on there, which is one good way to do this, you're going to be using a lot more CPU and allocating a lot more RAM to your 2016 farm compared to 2010. So be ready for that. It's a project cost. Also, don't try to do this as a one-person enterprise. You may be a dab hand at SQL and you may be a dab hand at this and that, but nobody is expert enough for any serious implementation to be able to do the full stack. For example, in this project we used about 10 different professionals, experts in SQL, experts in backup technologies, experts in virtual machine building, as well as the SharePoint and the migration and the solutions, etc. So just be aware, this is not a casual project. When you're deciding to upgrade yourself, obviously there's got to be a return on investment. You're going to have to assess where you are currently, what the business needs, and what you're going to be able to give them through doing this upgrade. Do a thorough evaluation before you even ask for the go-ahead for this project. Get the business case together, do lots of training, do very much testing, especially UAT, and try and work out your costs so that you can demonstrate that return on investment. The strongest case, of course, is the older version of SharePoint that you have, because of the support aspect and because of the missing features which you'll get in the newer versions. The strongest case for upgrade is, of course, legacy SharePoint versions. But I think even a move from 2013 to 2019 may now be warranted, looking at the state of the market. That's pretty much it from me. So today we discussed the current state of the market, why we might want to upgrade, how we would design the farm, move those solutions over, and then move our content over. And of course, you got to hear my unofficial release notes, what goes right and wrong in this sort of project. So this was me, Jamie McAllister, and thank you very much for listening to my webcast.